Good afternoon. The Committee of the Whole is back in order. Senator Nicholas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a number of sheets that have been circulated that I'd like to proffer as a single amendment to the Budget Act. These various sheets include components for reprogramming Healthy Futures Fund money into the Guam Memorial Hospital and public health, reprogramming general fund money from those areas to reduce the Supplemental Appropriations Reserve Fund amounts in the Office of Magalahi, Department of Revenue and Taxation, Department of Administration, and the legislative branch as well, along with the Office of Finance and Budget. And the purpose of this amendment, Mr. Chairman, is we're trying to create a more an environment that will be more acceptable for all parties, wherein instead of having the Office of the Governor funded, for example, with only $1.5 million in general fund money and relying on $4.5 million in collections money, it's now going to be $4.9 million in general fund money and $2.1 million in collections money. So they will have more flexibility on the general fund side, but they still will be obligated to collect something. Same goes for Revenue and Taxation and the Department of Administration. The Guam Memorial Hospital and the Department of Public Health will still be fully funded by a reliable funding source in the Healthy Futures Fund, which is enjoying a revenue increase as a result of the tobacco tax adjustments that are in this bill. And so as a single amendment, Mr. Chairman, I proffer these various components as a compromise in order to move our Budget Act forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any senators who wish to speak on the Senator Nicholas amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on this Nicholas amendment? Senator Argan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I certainly appreciate the efforts of what is being put forward, but like during our closing comments last evening, one of the statements that I had made is that in the mandate establishing the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund, we may have to go in there and adjust the language or add to the language to ensure that any outstanding receivables in excess of 1 year or 2 years now would be recognized as being deposited into the SAR fund. And then that would safeguard and allow for that policy to be implemented and in recognition of those proceeds being deposited therein. So I think that we heard enough from the representatives of the administration saying that they've already collected $25 million of amnesty funds and it's gone towards obligations of the government of Guam. And rather than going towards the SAR fund and allowing this body to be able to appropriate it. So I think that may be a concern in regards to how this is recognized, but certainly I understand exactly what the mover of the amendment is trying to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Argan. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to again recognize our colleague, the mover of this amendment. When this was first done in the previous bill, I recognized how the efforts in trying to kind of resolve the shortfalls we had and trying to be creative and thinking out the box. But as the mover of the as the individual who opposed that amendment during the last bill, I'm going to have to oppose it again this time around. Relying on the SAR fund to fund several operations as we're seeing here in one fiscal year is concerning, and that's what I've stated in the past. Moreover, what's more concerning to me is that we have deprioritized the labor and delivery ward renovations by saying the entire funding for that, the entire funding source for that would be this fund. And so for those reasons, Mr. Chair, I would object to this amendment.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Early on, I supported this amendment because I believed that it would push DRT and DOA to collect revenue sources. And they came in last night and they explained very clearly to us that they cannot track the money that comes in through the SAR fund. There's nothing that tags the dollar for dollar that shows what revenue exactly does come in into the SAR fund. And so, in essence, Mr. Speaker, there's a conflict on how we reconcile the tax amnesty money coming in, the other projections coming in, such as the BPT coming in, because once they get into the general fund, we don't know, or they do not identify it as tax amnesty dollars or dollars from the BPT. And so this amendment is posing a risk on operations. However, I'm still discerning on this specific amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any? Senator Agon.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Speaker. You know, based on the statements from the chair of the Committee on Health, in addition to the allocation of $11 million, because there are some questions still being raised about the SAR fund, perhaps one of the other approaches is to keep the original appropriation and the mechanism in place. Because even if this nearing the end of the calendar year, even if the GIDA as well as GMH is not able to effectuate that, there may be a renewed interest in terms of looking at seriously entertaining GIDA, acquiring financing to be able to complete the labor and delivery room. So that again is another option. And then the question would be, would we be double allocating? To me, it's a safeguard, making sure that the existing mechanism that has been recognized and that this legislature, as well as the chair of the Committee on Health, has been advocating for and pushing repeatedly, that $600,000 allocation out of the general fund will still be available should that mechanism be realized subsequent to this calendar year. So that may be an issue in terms of, or an approach in terms of being able to alleviate and address some of the concerns of the Chair of Health.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? There's been an objection. Senator Snickers, do you wish to close?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I too heard the statements from the fiscal team last night with respect to their inability or their claim to have an inability to distinguish when monies come in as to whether or not they're collections, amnesty monies, or regular monies. But Mr. Chairman, we need to always remember that collections and amnesty all have to be filed in a unique way, because they will immediately have interest and penalties associated with them due to their delinquency. If you're able to tag the monies due to a delinquency, you're able to track the monies as they come into the system. And those monies should be put into the SAR fund. They should be put into the Supplemental Appropriations Reserve Fund or Revenue Fund. So, and it just further underscores why I just have a disappointment in the fiscal team with respect to the common inconsistencies they have in what they say and what they put into practice in order to fit one scenario or another. You can't say you can't track the money if you already need to tag the money as being delinquent. That's willful blindness. I thank my colleagues for considering these amendments. I know that there are some shared concerns with the Supplemental Appropriations Revenue Fund as being a funding mechanism for these agencies, but these amendments are compromised to further reduce the need for those agencies to rely on the very collections that they are responsible for. The fiscal team is on the record saying that between 2 and 3 million every year can be collected, and now we're reducing their funding reliance down to just 10. So out of an anticipated 24 to 36 million in collections in the next fiscal year, we are now saying all you need to do is collect 10 out of what you project you know you're going to bring in. At 20 to 30, all you need to do is use 10 for your operations. And so it really is approaching the point of just being symbolic, Mr. Chairman, but it's an important symbol to show that we're prioritizing collections as a matter of course in the way we're approaching this budget that is already incorporating so many compromises from many members with respect to revenue generation, cuts, and collections. So I thank my colleagues for their consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll take a short recess. Is Tommy coming back?
Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw the amendments.
The amendment is being withdrawn. Amendment's been withdrawn. We have a few minutes. I have to run copies of another proposal.
Good afternoon, Senators. Committee Hall is now back in session. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before you, I've provided the members with a series of amendments which start with the increase in the Section 30 funds in the revenue. We had put 68 in, but last night we heard from the administration that before about the 8th of August, the other day, they had written to Department of Interior and Treasury that they were requesting a Section 30 of 78 million for this year, and that they had not had any problems with receiving whatever it was that they were requesting. So I'm proposing that we increase the revenue in Section 30 to 78. That increased amount plus on the next page, I'm proposing that we move the labor and delivery room from we not appropriate for that one, but we reinstate the 600,000 for its loan. And so with that, 9 million from the Section 30 and the 11 million from the L&D, we receive the $20 million that we are short. And with the $20 million short, we then go back and take all the excess Healthy Futures Fund from the hospital, from the Department of Public Health and Social Services, but their bottom line stays the same. It becomes Healthy Futures Fund rather than general fund. And after doing that, using the Healthy Futures Fund to balance the hospital and the Department of Public Health and Social Services, there's enough then general fund to be able to reinstate the original appropriation to the governor's office, all with general fund, no SARs anymore. And so then we would have to delete the mention of SAR on the next page. We would reinstate Department of Administration to the original amount that they
I'm sorry, Speaker Cruz. Senators, I hope you're following Speaker Cruz's proposed amendment. He's going page by page, so I need to ensure that everyone is tracking in terms of understanding his presentation. Okay, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker Cruz. You may proceed.
So then we then go back and remove the SAR appropriation to the Department of Administration, backfill it with general fund, reinstating its original appropriation under 323. On the next page, we do the same thing for revenue and taxation. And the legislative branch. So with that all done, we then just remove SAR as an AU on the revenue page to take care of that whole set. We have additional money, very small amount, but the tax collector, the attorney, was originally appropriated for under SAR. We'll now make it a general fund appropriation. And with the balance of about 600,000, we dump that into GDOE. It's just as a showing that that's our priority to make sure that GDOE is funded as much as possible. And I've been assured by OFB that with all of these amendments, the bill will be balanced with all the amendments that are in this as a package. But it is first on increasing the revenue in Section 30, and then everything else falls in place with the approval of the 3 revenue sources yesterday: the real property tax, the business privilege tax, and the tobacco tax. Just so that everybody has a better, I hope that's clear. If not, I can try to just, with numbers, I tried to have it done with numbers to show that the bill as originally introduced included a provision for the real property tax in whole, not just for the property above $1 million. When we struck that, we lost 23 million from the bill, and so we were short 23. But we rebalanced it by getting 8.2 from real property tax over $1 million, tobacco tax, and Section 30, so that we make up for that 23. And with that, we put back 500 for the GRSP appropriation to fund that retirement. We'll fund the GFD and the Office of Attorney General tax collector and the GDOE appropriation. So that's where all the balance is at. Okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your amendment. There's an amendment on the floor, Mr. Speaker. Is it your preference to entertain the entire packet?
Please.
Okay. There's an amendment on the floor, 11 different components to it. Any discussion? Vice Speaker Talai, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this amendment. I think it is prudent for us to, if we know we're going to receive the 78, to appropriate it and direct where that will be spent. I think it's unfortunate that last year what was appropriated was less than what was actually received. So we were not able to dictate where that extra 10 million was actually spent. But I think it's that the Speaker's correct, that the Reverend Tax last night pretty much said that for all the years that they have been doing this, they've always received what they have requested in Section 30 money. So I think this is reliable, and we will, sounds like definitely know before the end of September in any case. So I support the amendment to give some additional reliable source of funding for operations for these agencies, and I thank the Speaker for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. Any further discussion on Speaker Cruz's amendment? Senator Rodriguez, you're recognized on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have no objections to this amendment because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong unless I missed it, the Speaker is removing the SAR as a revenue source. Just double checking, and so that's correct, right? So the SAR is being removed from this amendment, so I have no problem with that. The only concern I have, Mr. Chair, is that we had an opportunity here to complete one of the projects that for many years, even the past legislature has been advocating for, is the renovation of the labor and delivery ward. And this is an opportunity for us, because I say that because our government has invested, our people have invested in the A&E for this project. And unlike other projects that our government, our people want us to complete, that's really one of the biggest steps that we have to take first is get the A&E done so that you can proceed and move forward. Just like you're doing your efforts, Mr. Chair, with the Simon Sanchez renovation. And so the opportunity we're missing here is that the current bill, as it is, dedicates the tobacco tax increases for that purpose. And I understand that there may be some concerns with using it for that purpose, and so and not having any objections to this amendment, perhaps I'd like to make an amendment to this amendment, Mr. Chair, that instead of going back to how we've initially proposed going out and borrowing and financing the L&D renovation, because even that has failed us over the past few years. There was an attempt to get it through USDA. There was an attempt to do a direct financing, but that all fell through. And the opportunity we have here is that if we can identify a clear funding source for that project, then things can move forward. With the tobacco tax increase, the proceeds would have been enough to get this project done in 1 year. And so the amendment I'd like to move, Mr. Chair, is to utilize, and if legal counsel perhaps or the clerks can assist us with this amendment, is to utilize option 24 of the revenue enhancement dated July 28 that the Office of Finance and Budget had provided us. Option 24 is the repeal deduction of other expenses, including salaries, bonuses, rent, etc. This is related to banking activities. And so this provision, Mr. Chair, did have a public hearing. It was Bill 230 that was publicly heard, and this was a provision that was heard. And so that would be my amendment, to amend this section of the Speaker's amendment, the second page. And if we want to take a brief recess, I can prepare that, work with...
Yes, please, Senator Rodriguez.
Okay. Thank you.
Prepare the amendment. Thank you. Committee in the whole is now back in session. Senators, you all have a copy on your desk with the proposed amendment by Senator Rodriguez, and I would like to ask him if he would like to also highlight it again. Otherwise, we'll move on to continue the discussion. Senator Rodriguez, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my amendment, just to recap what it does, is to amend the current amendment before us by Speaker Cruz. This deals with the GMHA Labor and Delivery Ward in an attempt to continue the celebration we had, at least for some of us here the other day, in terms of moving forward with the L&D renovation at the hospital, and for the first time in going into a major capital improvement project without financing, without outside financing, and paying for it within a course of a fiscal year. And in this case, we estimate that it would take about 2 fiscal years for us to raise the required funds needed to complete the project. And so how we plan to do that, Mr. Chair, is to amend how banks calculate their gross receipts tax. Right now, existing statute states that banks are allowed to calculate their GRT obligations based on their net income. Very different from any other industry on island. And so I know I've attempted to bring this proposal to the floor as well in the past. It was defeated on the floor, and I listened to some of the concerns that were brought up during that time. And so this time around, I've incorporated those concerns that were brought up, and we've taken out some of the expenses that banks are able to use to calculate their GRT obligation. Some of the concerns, Mr. Chair, back perhaps a few months ago, was that the interest or discounts paid by banking institutions must still remain there, right? And so I've heard the concerns from this body, and so I've this go around attempted to remove that, and only remove the allowance of the banking institutions to deduct administrative costs. And administrative costs are salaries, bonuses paid to their executives, rent, marketing, all administrative costs that now that they have the luxury of deducting in terms of calculation of their GRT is now being removed. And to hopefully, as a compromise to some of our colleagues here, is that I've also included a sunset provision on this. And so the sunset provision would allow us to raise the required amount to fully fund the L&D renovation of the hospital, and really leave it up to the future legislature to make that decision whether they want to extend this provision that we're trying to amend today into the future. And so it also give us time to take a look and see if there's any impact in the industry, which really I don't believe there is. One of the beauties of us moving this forward at this time, Mr. Chair, is that with the tax cuts, with the federal tax cuts that are upon us, banks and a lot of other corporations have now receiving a substantial amount of reduction in their tax rate. For example, some of the data that we've been looking at here is that if a bank is paying $8 million in corporate income tax pre-tax cuts, the assumption is that with the tax cuts in place now, that's about a $3.2 million reduction in what they will be paying in income taxes. And so, their income tax obligation now would be roughly around $4.5 million. And so it's really timing. I believe that that we're moving this forward, and it's really for a project that this body and previous legislatures have indicated is a priority and must move forward. And so that's my amendment, Mr. Chair, and hoping that the body would support this measure.
Thank you very much, Senator Rodriguez. Any discussion on Senator Rodriguez's amendment to Speaker Cruz's amendment? Senator Torres, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just request that I be recused from discussing or voting on this amendment because my family as well as I have some financial interest in lending institution.
There's been a request for consideration that Senator Torres recuse herself from voting. Is there any objection to that request? Any objection to that request? No objections, so recognized. Senator Torres should recuse. Any other discussion on Senator Rodriguez's amendment to Speaker Cruz's amendment? Senator Espadon, you recognize.
Mr. Chair, then along the same lines, my family also has interest not in a banking institution, but in a small lending institution. But I'll leave it up to this body of whether I'll be allowed to vote on this measure or not.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Senator Espadon likewise has requested to be recused from voting on the amendment proffered by Senator Rodriguez. Any objections? There's an objection on the floor. On Senator Espadon's request for excusal, please signify. Okay, there's been reconsideration and rescinding of the initial objection. Okay, any objection on the request by Senator Espadon to recuse himself from voting on the measure that the amendment by Senator Rodriguez? Any objection? No objection, so ordered. On Senator Rodriguez's amendment, Senator St. Nicholas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment, in the context with the parent amendment and in the context of the entire bill, would represent, I believe, the third tax increase in this bill and the fourth tax increase if we were to count the removal of the sunset provision of the business privilege tax. This amendment, in context of its parent amendment, would not only represent the third tax increase, but it would be a component of additional tax increases with an abdication of a mandate to collect, thus contributing to the transformation of this budget bill into just a blanket tax increase bill. This new tax that's being proposed, this third tax, is a tax on our financial institutions. And Mr. Chairman, all you got to do is pull up the labor and statistics report. You'll find that these are actually one of our better paying institutions. They pay our people well. We weren't willing to accept a hotel occupancy tax that doesn't pay our people well and puts so many of them onto the EITC rolls and doesn't provide them with health insurance and puts so many of them into the medical liability category that results in unfunded mandates on GMH. We still didn't want to tax that, but we want to tax the financial institutions that have a base salary that pays well and provides health insurance to most of its employees, including its primetime employees. Mr. Chairman, I think one of the first companies to announce a pay raise on Guam with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was Bank of Hawaii, a financial institution. Came out and said, we're raising salaries. These are the kinds of companies that I would prefer on a tax policy basis we continue supporting and set an example to those other kinds of companies that just create liabilities for our taxpayers because they don't pass through their corporate tax savings to the wages of their workers. In our quest for revenue, we have to just make sure that we're not sending mixed signals. Banking also, Mr. Chairman, touches on every consumer. Banks fund themselves through two sources, interest and fees. Interest in the form of the interest you pay on your loans, fees in the form of the fees you pay when you use an ATM machine or when you go below your minimum balance, and that's it. And so if you raise the tax on a financial institution, ultimately it's going to result in an impact on interest rates or fees. And those are paid by our people. A hotel occupancy tax is paid by those who occupy the hotels, and with the exception of some of us who try and grab a room to catch the fireworks on New Year's, it's inconsequential to the residential taxpayer, the local taxpayer. So I object to this tax, Mr. Chairman, not because I don't support the project that it's seeking to fund, but because it would be a third tax and a fourth tax if we count the removal of the sunset on a bill that is not going to be mandating any collections, and it's a tax on an industry that has actually been a very responsible corporate citizen, not just in what it pays its workers and the insurance that it provides, but in the donations back to the community. Our financial institutions are some of our most generous. It would be a tax on, I think, perhaps our most corporate, our most publicly responsible industry in terms of how much they give back in the form of taking care of their employees and donating to the community. So I would need to object to the amendment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator San Nicolas. Any further discussion on the amendment by Senator Rodriguez? Any further discussion on the amendment by Senator Rodriguez to the primary amendment by Speaker Cruz? Senator Rodriguez, would you like to close?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues. Mr. Chair, considering this a tax increase is completely misguided. This is nowhere in any form increasing the taxes. It's level the playing field. That's what it's called, Mr. Chair. It's one industry that is allowed to deduct administrative costs prior to their calculation of their BPT. In 2007, when the former Governor Felix Camacho's administration presented this to the people of Guam, to the legislature, we look back and look at the testimony, what was presented there. Nowhere in those testimonies, Mr. Chair, did anyone ever provide a rationale, a reasonable rationale as to why we shouldn't do this. What was presented at that time, Mr. Chair, was that we shouldn't do this because we're going to be sacrificing the profits of these corporations. That's on record, Mr. Chair. And considering the substantial reduction in their income tax that these corporations have received, I don't think it's too much, Mr. Chair, to ask that we have them calculate their tax obligation just like every other industry on island. And so I'm hoping with the concessions that have been made in this amendment, that our colleagues consider voting for this amendment. We know that if this is part of the budget bill, it will be signed by the governor because even this current governor has proposed this same provision in Bill 230. And so if we really want to move this project forward, which we should, Mr. Chair, then I'm asking our colleagues to please support this amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Rodriguez. On Senator Rodriguez's amendment to the primary amendment by Speaker Cruz, with two of our colleagues, Senator Torres and Senator Espadon, recusing themselves on the proposed amendment, there's been an objection. Please signify by raising your hands. Amendment fails. On the primary amendment by Speaker Cruz, any further discussion? Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized on the primary amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I alluded to in my remarks previously, this amendment substantially changes the flavor of this Budget Act and makes it predominantly a tax increase budget. Mr. Chairman, when we went through the whole exercise back in April that resulted in the 1% increase in the business privilege tax that was supposed to sunset October 1st, it also came with a caveat of about $30 million in fiscal realignment. And that was for the remaining half of the fiscal year. So if you factor that into a full fiscal year, it should have come out to about $60 million in fiscal realignment. If we were able, after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to operate with a prorated $60 million in cuts and 1% business privilege tax, then why aren't we able to operate under the same premise today? Today, in this Budget Act, we not only are keeping that 1% and keeping those same cuts, we're not adding to the cuts, but we're also increasing the property tax, and we're also increasing the tobacco tax. Why? Why are we increasing the taxes when the financial circumstances haven't changed? And the reason, Mr. Chairman, is partly incorporated in the components of this amendment. The first is the Section 30 figure. The unspoken nightmare that is this Section 30 appropriation is that it's going to be spent before it's even received. That's happened every single fiscal year. It's going to happen this fiscal year, and the reason, Mr. Chairman, is because it needs to be used for tax refunds. It's not an option. It has to be used for that in order to make up for the tax refund shortfall and comply with the court-ordered mandate to pay within 6 months of a clean filing. So this money's gone. We put it into our budgets, we add it to the general fund, but the cash is gone. It's already a $68 million hole. This amendment will make it a $78 million hole, a $10 million hole deeper. It's going to exacerbate the deficit. And it's that practice that is having us constantly trying to gasp for air while we keep drowning ourselves. And these gasps for air are starting to materialize in tax increases. These amendments change what we've adopted in SAR mandated funding in an attempt to placate the administration, who's already very clearly signaled they're going to veto any budget that has any SAR appropriations to their agencies. The point of us making those appropriations was to try and change the behavior that has been drowning us by compelling collections to fund operations. Mr. Chairman, the other night, the Director of Revenue and Taxation informed us that of the $34 million in tax amnesty, $18 million was unfiled and delinquent taxes. $18 million walked in the door and materialized without us even knowing it was there. An inability to not only collect but to reconcile what should have been assessed. And that's 18 million. In their handout that they provided to us, there's 194 million. In their testimony, they said it's 73. In their handout, they indicate that 53 million is under aggressive collection, and that's the taxes that we know about. And yet we're still unwilling to mandate that those collections fund the government. We don't want to mandate it. We're okay with raising taxes on our people, but we're still unwilling to mandate this government collects and funds itself with those collections. I understand that there is a desire to pass a budget, but it's that same concessionary approach that resulted in what turned out to be a disastrous BPT and sales tax proposal. Disastrous because we passed that back in April, saying we're going to sunset the BPT and saying we're going to increase sales taxes, only to roll back the sales taxes, and now, in this Budget Act, roll back the sunset. That's what happens when we're unwilling to hold the line with what we philosophically know we should do. We should compel this government to collect. We should compel this government to do so and not raise taxes. And we certainly should compel this government to do so and not knowingly walk ourselves into a deeper deficit with an increased Section 30 figure, knowing full well that Section 30 money is going to be spent before it even hits the coffers. I understand that this budget process has been unique. We have an opportunity with this budget to make it unique for the benefit of the people of Guam, or we can adopt these amendments and continue the same practices of deficit spending, increasing taxes, not compelling collections for operations, and carrying forward the same cuts that we had, same cuts that we have now, with just so many more taxes layered on top of it. These amendments represent a continuation of the same behaviors, not a change. And it would effectively transform this budget. It would restore the office of the governor to be fully funded by general fund. No need to collect anything. DRT, fully funded by general fund. No need to collect anything. DOA, fully funded by general fund. No need to collect anything. That's what these amendments will do. It will put us into the status quo with more taxes on top of it and no change for our people. I don't think that's what they want us to do. And I understand the challenge is trying to manifest that change in a way that would not necessarily satisfy everybody, but at least be a representation of what the expectation is. And that expectation is being so clearly articulated by everybody who's running for governor, saying we're going to collect to make up the shortfall, we're not going to raise taxes. But as a policy statement, that's not what we're going to be doing with this budget if we pass these amendments. I understand the intent of the amendments is to take us past a place where that previous budget failed by a vote of 6-9. But if the only alternative is to revert it entirely back to the status quo, I don't know if it will pass or not, but I do know that it will be the same thing next fiscal year and that's just going to disappoint our people. I object to the amendment on those grounds, Mr. Chairman. I know that if we include anything with supplemental appropriations revenue, anything that requires this governor to collect, he's going to veto it. I know that an override of a veto is a tall order. But there has to come a point. There has to come a point where placating, or I guess to put it nicer, working with the governor has got to be a lesser priority than working for the people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. Any further discussion on the amendment by Speaker Cruz? Senator Esteves, you're recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there were a lot of interesting discussions last night, and I think there were a couple points highlighted. In this budget, we have no appropriation or no mechanism to pay down the deficit. The SAR fund, as I understand, through aggressive tax collection, was supposed to be supplemental revenue in excess of what we project for the budget for operations. And while I could get behind the idea, and I've been behind the idea of using it for operations, I think it's important to understand that there's no such thing as a surplus when you have a $73 million deficit. I don't care what words are used. Oh, it's an annual surplus. A surplus does not exist when you have a deficit. You're not in the positive when you have debt. With regards to using the SAR fund for operations, which in the best of circumstances I could get behind, these are not the best of circumstances. And unless this body is willing to go back, look at appropriate cuts, and dedicate that to deficit reduction, I do not at this point believe that it would be appropriate to use the SAR for operations. Everything going, and I think it's, you know, and I'm glad it was highlighted last night, because I think it might be something for the future to identify, Mr. Chairman, that we need to put the deficit in the budget. And so that when we're comparing all of the different interests and needs of the government, that it's never lost upon us that we're $73 million behind in prior obligations, partly because of the budgeting, in large part because of this body over multiple fiscal years, and in part because of things that are outside of our control. And now, you know, I commend the work that this body has done, even before me, to get to a point where we're closer in terms of revenue projection than we've ever been. But we can't simply turn our blinders on and ignore the fact that we're $73 million behind in appropriating forward. With regard to the amendment before us of increasing the amount of Section 30, you know, I want to highlight 3 points with regards to changing the number from approximately 68 million to 78 million. In last year's budget, we reduced the number to 68 million, absolutely convinced that the threshold was 68 million. And we were wrong. The money came in at 78 million, and we did not have the opportunity to appropriate that 10 million. Regardless of whether it's spent or not, that was 10 million this body failed to appropriate. And that failure leads, it's the governor's prerogative, and I don't agree with it, that they might use it before they're supposed to use it or use it on something else not appropriated. But our position in this body is to appropriate those funds that we project to receive. And so to highlight the 3 points moving forward with the discussion on moving the appropriation and the projection up from 68 million to 78 million. Point number 1, Mr. Chairman. Last year, we appropriated down to 68 million and we were wrong. Point number 2, we were wrong. Point number 3, we were wrong. And so moving forward, we could potentially make the same mistake, appropriate down to 68 million. The money comes in at 78 million, and that's $10 million not appropriated or spent. We have not received the check yet for the upcoming fiscal year. And so there's still time for this body to appropriate that and earmark it. Also noting that if the tax amnesty money that we've been collecting has been used for tax refunds, then maybe the necessity for that 10 million of Section 30 money won't be there to spend it ahead of time. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of guessing. But what I do know are those 3 points, as previously highlighted, is history that we can't forget. We did drop the ball on that. And so, I do, while I have my convictions about the bill in its entirety, I do believe this is a good measure. I do believe it is a fair compromise. And I'd like to lend my support to the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Any further discussion of Speaker Cruz's amendment? Any further discussion on Speaker Cruz's amendment? Speaker Cruz, if you would like to close.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, can I just ask for a very, very short recess? A short recess.
5-minute recess. Senators, the committee in the whole is now back in session. We have before us Speaker Cruz has concluded his comments on his proposed amendment. We're going to take a vote.
There was an objection, Mr. Chairman, so
Yes, I do recognize that. One minute recess. The committee of the whole is now back in session. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your patience. On Speaker Cruz's amendment, there's been an objection. All those in favor of adopting Speaker Cruz's amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Amendment passes. Any other discussion on Bill number 323? As for the amendment on the committee in the whole. Speaker Cruz, you recognize.
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on the administrative provisions, on section 4, administrative provision,
Okay.
can I preface it with effective January the 3rd, 2019?
Can you identify the page, Mr. Speaker?
I think it's 131. but-
131. Senators, are you following? Page
Or
131
132.
and 132. Okay, Mr. Speaker, again, if you can repeat your amendment.
Notwithstanding any provision of law, rule, or regulation, beginning, change that date to January the 7th, 2019. 132 of the...
Section, Mr. Speaker?
Section 4.
Section 4.
I think the pages may be off. I have the wrong one here.
Okay, colleagues, if you can turn, I believe,
No, it's
I was
the,
just told
it's
it's on
the
page
position on the
174.
directors.
Page 174, Senators, Section 4. And Mr. Speaker, you're asking to adjust that date beginning on January 1st, 2019? Senators, Section 4, page 174, line 13. The Speaker's amendment is to beginning on January 1st, 2019. Any discussion on Speaker Cruz? Did you want to discuss it?
No.
Okay, any discussion on Speaker Cruz's amendment? Any discussion on Speaker Cruz's amendment? Any objection on Speaker Cruz's amendment? Any objection on the proposed amendment? No objections? So ordered. Any further discussion on Bill number 323 as amended, further amended on the floor? Vice Speaker Talahi, you had your hands up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They're passing out an amendment I'd like to make. It would be to put every gubernatorial candidate right now has argued that we do not need to raise taxes, that that they have new ideas, that they will be able to manage the government without raising taxes. And yesterday's motion to repeal the increase in GRT did not pass. But, so I would like to try this amendment to ensure that the next administration fulfills their promises for collection and efficiency. This would set a sunset on the increase in BPT at the end of the fiscal year. So it would give them, you know, I hope sufficient time to come up with realignment and collections.
Madam Vice Speaker, because you mentioned the end of the upcoming fiscal year, if you can take a look at the date that you want to make.
Have it in front of me. What is it?
Okay, 1 minute recess, please, so everyone can get a copy.
Oh. Mr.
Committee in the whole is now back in session. Vice Speaker Talai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and please forgive my typos, colleagues. So the amendment would read, Section 4, Business Privilege Tax Increase. And then I will add the following language to the current language in the bill. The language I'm going to add will read, and will expire on September 30, 2019, at which point the business privilege tax rate shall return to 4%. Correct, for 2019.
On the amendment by Vice Speaker Talai, Vice Speaker Talai, you have any other additional comments you want to add? Okay, on the proposed amendment by Vice Speaker Talahi, any discussion? Any discussion on the proposed amendment? There's an objection in the audience. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment by Vice Speaker Talahi?
Just a point of inquiry. Who was the objection to the... I'm just curious, Senator. I'm sorry?
There's been an objection. Vice Speaker Talai, would you like to close on your amendment? If not, we're going to call the vote. There's an objection on the proposed amendment. All those in favor of the proposed amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Amendment fails. Any further? Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor? Okay, Senator Torres, you're recognized. On the bill number 323-34 as further amended on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask the body for reconsideration of a prior amendment that I introduced to page 174, or 173, the end of page 173. My proposal is to add a new subsection I to read subsection I to section 2 of chapter 13, page 173 at the bottom, to read travel to attend.
I'm sorry, Senator Torres, please excuse me for injecting myself. On the previous amendment, so just the clerk has corrected themselves, and they recognize that there were sufficient votes for the previous amendment.
Okay.
Okay, I apologize, Senator Torres. You have the floor. The vote that was previously called and signified by the clerk stands. So the previous amendment did not pass. It had 7 affirmative votes. Senator Torres, you have the floor on page 173 and 174, correct?
Yes, so it's a motion to reconsider a prior amendment that I proffered to add a new subsection I to read travel to attend conferences and official meetings of national and regional organizations of which the entity is an official member.
Let me ask you, Senator Torres, from the chair's perspective, that amendment was entertained prior to the overall voting of the measure, right?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not a reconsideration, so there's no need to move for reconsideration of the vote. It's a consideration of an amendment that you have previously proffered. So in other
Yes, I
words, the
understand.
rule of order.
Correct, because
Okay.
we had
So
voted on
on
the bill.
Senator
All right.
Torres's amendment, did you want to continue your discussion?
Essentially, this amendment would just allow all those agencies that have membership in national organizations or heads of agencies to be able to travel to attend official meetings or conferences of which they're members. And this does not provide for any funding whatsoever. It just gives them the discretion to attend if it's within their agency's budget.
Thank you, Senator Torres. On Senator Torres's amendment to add a new subsection to section 2, page 173. Any discussion on Senator Torres's amendment? Any discussion on Senator Torres's amendment? Vice Speaker Talai, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much recognize, the importance of and what Guam has gained by membership of in these organizations, and especially, policy, how we're able to move policy because of that. But I'm just concerned because the rest of the language in that section of the bill prohibits almost all travel, including travel by the governor and travel by DOE to go to talk to a DOI regarding, getting out of the third-party agreement, things like that are critical. I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is I recognize that our bill right now is cutting off even critical travel, but I just think we need, and even by the governor and everyone who needs to talk to DOI, Congress, whatever. But I think we need to kind of come up with a policy for all of that critical travel as well. So I object to that amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Speaker Talai. Any further discussion on Senator Torres's amendment? Senator San Agustin, you recognize.
I just have a very simple question. There are many travel by the government that's critical. I'm just concerned, as the previous speaker and as the author of the amendment, why are we even prohibiting? If the agency has funds and they have the ability and the concern that it's needed, they should just travel. Because on every travel, which I've done when I was in the Board of Education, it always led to possible grants, possible relief for the Department of Education. So I believe that if the agency needs to travel and they have the funds, they should be allowed to travel. So I would only amend that we just strike that whole section so that travel can be allowed and let the agency have the flexibility.
Senator San Agustin's amendment to the amendment. Senator San Agustin, I think we need to entertain your amendment separate from the proposed amendment by Senator Torres, because you're looking at striking the entire section. Okay, so Senator San Agustin, I'll come back to you. Any further discussion on Senator Torres' amendment? Senator Torres, did you want to close?
I had anticipated, Mr. Chair, that this would, and I'm trying to find the appropriate language, but that this would allow, for example, the heads of agencies, which the agency is a member, like fisheries or governors' conferences or national or the Chief Justice's circuit or something of the like, that would allow heads of agencies to attend. It's not contemplated that it's I had attempted to make the language broad. Perhaps there's another way that we can specifically name those individuals that we expect to not be restricted, like the governor or the chief justice or directors or so. I don't know, but this I thought would be broad enough to allow that thing. But can we recess? I think we need to reword this.
5-minute recess. Senators, the committee on the whole is back in session. Senator Torres, you're recognized on your amendment.
Mr. Chair, I request that I set this aside for now, please.
Okay, Senator Torres has withdrawn her proposed amendment. Senator San Augustine, you're recognized on the same section, section 2, page 173.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to move that we strike section 2 and let the agency determine if the importance and the need to travel. And as long as they have funds to travel, they understand that they have to live within their funding source. And no additional funding for that.
Thank you, Senator San Augustine. Any discussion on Senator San Augustine's amendment to delete section 2, page 173? Any further discussion on Senator San Augustine's amendment? Any objection? There's an objection. Senator San Augustine's amendment is on page 173, section 2, to delete the entire section. There's been an objection on the proposed amendment. Any further discussion? Because of the objection, I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor of Senator San Augustine's amendment to delete section 2, page 173, please signify by raising your hands. There's a count of 5 by the clerk. Amendment fails. Any further? Any further discussion of Bill number 323 as further amended on the floor in the committee on the whole? Any further discussion? Senator Rodriguez, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I would like to move that section 6 on page 175, the certification pay differential, that be stricken. That is a, heard the objection already. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, really, when we passed this measure, Mr. Chair, back in, I believe it was in 2015, Public Law 3318, I believe, it was really to recognize the financial managers in our government who have certified skills. Was really to ensure that they provide the people of Guam with efficient, transparent, and honest fiscal operations. When you compare the amount of pay that these individuals receive in the government versus their counterparts in the private sector, there's a disparity. And in an effort to ensure that we retain these professionals in the government, we move forward with this mandate. And my understanding, Mr. Chair, that although it's a savings, it really pales in comparison to what the benefits are of what these individuals bring to our government. I understand it may be about 100,000 or less. I don't know what OFB has, but I know at DOA alone, it's minimal. It's very minimal. I believe it's less than 20,000 at DOA. And so I'm asking my colleagues to support this effort to strike this provision out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rodriguez. Any discussion, Senator Rodriguez amendment to delete section 6 on page 175? Any further discussion on Senator Rodriguez's amendment to delete section 6 on page 175? No further discussion. Senator Rodriguez, would you like to close? There's been an objection. There is an objection on the proposed amendment. So all those in favor of the proposed amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Amendment fails. Any further discussion on Bill number 323 as further amended by the Committee in the Whole? Any further discussion? Speaker, or Senator Nicholas, you're recognized. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of the amnesty conversations we've had and some conversations we've had considering the possibility of addressing some amnesty appropriations as separate bills in this current session, notwithstanding, Mr. Chairman, I think that we have a gross imbalance in our amnesty appropriations relative to funds available. And so at this time, I'd like to make a motion to just strike all amnesty appropriations in the current budget with the understanding that there may be a motion to place certain amnesty appropriations bills on this session agenda to address it as standalone measures as opposed to budgetary appropriations. Mr. Chairman.
There's a motion by Senator Nicholas to delete all references to amnesty funding appropriations in Bill number 323 as further amended by the Committee in the Whole. Any discussion on that particular, on the understanding and the premise, Senator Nicholas, if you can clarify the understanding that in fact subsequent legislation will be entertained in the same emergency session, or?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, perhaps a motion after we rise, perhaps prior to us adjourning, we can make a motion notwithstanding the House rules to place the bills that would address the appropriations for amnesty money, to have them addressed immediately, so that those can be handled as separate measures, but to not do them necessarily within this budget, as it causes a convolution in the overall amnesty appropriations.
Just so that we can get a confirmation from the good speaker, Speaker Cruz, is that the intent of the seat of the speaker?
Mr. Chairman, inasmuch as we're not sure whether or not this budget bill will pass, maybe it would be in the best interest of those two projects to have them separated.
Okay, thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. On Senator Nicholas's amendment to delete any reference to the application and appropriation of amnesty funds that are generated in fiscal year 18. Any further discussion? Any further discussion? If not, Senator Nicholas, would you like to close? Any objection on the amendment? Any objection on the amendment? No objection? So ordered. Thank you, Senator Nicholas. Any further discussion on Bill number 323? Senator Mary Torres, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to again discuss my amendment. The amendment, I've modified it a little bit, if I may. If I may, please, Mr. Chairman, if you will so indulge me at this late hour of the day. My amendment is to the bottom of page 174, and it is to add a new subsection I, which will read, travel to attend conferences and official meetings with national and regional officials or national and regional organizations of which the entity is an official member. And if I may so explain, this will then allow the governor, for example, to meet with federal officials as is needed for Guam matters, or to attend things like National Governor Association meetings, or the Western Pacific leadership conferences, and things of that nature. And that is the reason that I would like to include this, so that all those restrictions on our highest government officials, to include our governor, chief justice, and our speaker, are then, that restriction is then lifted.
On Senator Mary Torres' amendment, you have the exact language. Can you please repeat the exact language, your language, please?
Subsection I,
Yes.
travel to attend conferences and official meetings with national and regional officials, national and regional government officials, or national and regional organizations of which the entity is an official member.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. If there's no objection on voting, proceeding with the vote on this particular amendment without it in writing, we will proceed with the vote. There's an objection. Senator Torres, if I can ask you to prepare that in writing, please. 5-minute recess.
Colleagues, the written amendment has been circulated. Senator Torres, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the amendment is before everybody, and I'll repeat it again. It is to add a new subsection I to page 173 at the bottom, to read travel to attend conferences and official meetings with national and regional government officials or national or regional organizations of which the entity is an official member. The idea is just to allow all heads to travel as they need to conduct official business of the government or to attend conferences of which they or their entity is an official member.
On the amendment, any senator wish to be heard? On the amendment, any Senator Nelson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd humbly have to rise in objection of this amendment. What we're doing here, Mr. Speaker, is we've increased taxes, we've cut the government, and now we're saying this amendment is basically saying that almost anyone can travel on the taxpayer's dime. Although I do appreciate that we pay money to be members of these government organizations, but we cannot go on start going on I don't know, conferences on the taxpayer's dime during this dire fiscal state that we are in. If we do this, what are the people going to think? If we do this, I essentially feel, for me, that it does not reflect the urgency of cuts. Because we're going to allow the government to pay for trips. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard?
May I close?
Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we discussed a similar amendment in a previous bill, a point was raised that we do spend quite a large amount of money sometimes to be members of these national or regional organizations. And I think that aside, there are many entities within our government, for example, UOG, GCC, and the Department of Education in particular, that require those face-to-face meetings. Most recently, the superintendent of DOE was able to get a face-to-face meeting with the Secretary of Education to have conversations about their status. In addition, there's many grants have been given to almost all of our agencies, federal grants, because of some of this face-to-face travel. And when you're so far removed, I mean, Guam is out of sight, out of mind. And so I rise in support of this amendment because it doesn't identify the funds for this travel, but it allows the agency the flexibility. If they think that this is going to be a really good return on their minimal investment, then that's their prerogative. We're giving them the flexibility to make those decisions. If it really is a crisis, if it really is critical for them to meet with these officials, to have the face-to-face conversations, and to describe to them what's going on here on Guam. And so for that reason, I rise in support of this amendment, and I thank the author for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, a question. Did we defund travel, the travel allotments that were requested by the agencies, Mr. Chairman?
They weren't funded.
They were not.
Not defunded, but they weren't funded.
Okay. And so my take on it, Mr. Chairman, is that from a policy perspective, we're clearly not funding the travel. However, if the agency is in the middle of negotiating or working out outcomes that may in fact be of benefit that they feel is worth making the sacrifice for, that's what basically this amendment would do. I'd like to just refresh the memory of the body on several things, because in the course of this budget proceedings, we've attempted to appropriate in certain areas, and some of those appropriations were actually the fruits of the labor that was cultivated from these organizations. I know that the program that we're constantly trying to find funding for example, the release of pretrial detainees and the monitoring system, I know that was a result of being able to attend these programs and figure out that these programs are available. I know that our conferences to reduce recidivism of inmates, that helps us to establish these court programs that help us to eventually reduce the number of inmates that we have on our overcrowded prison as also a result of attending some of these conferences. My point, Mr. Chairman, is I don't think we should be traveling when times are lean, and I think that as a policy group, we can definitely show that as a priority of this body by not funding it. However, I do want to continue to allow for the latitude in that if an agency, even if the funding was not allotted, still believes that it's worth the investment, they can internally figure out what sacrifices to make and make those kind of management decisions. So perhaps they won't hire another position, or perhaps they won't move forward another pay adjustment, or perhaps they won't make some other expense, and then instead they'll continue to fund these types of relationship investments. These are very difficult to quantify, and they're also very difficult to nail down. I mean, sometimes you have some organizations where they're traveling and you're like, what are you doing? You know, but other times you have some institutions that are actually prudent stewards with the resources that they're allocating. I think that a recent amendment that was proffered by the retiring speaker will help us to weed that out, and that's the amendment that requires for a travel report to be submitted by all agencies and instrumentalities of the government. That's currently not uniform and not allowed to be viewed, because different agencies have different ways of tracking that, but we are now, with a recent amendment by my colleague, are going to be able to track that. So we can weed these things out. I'm just afraid that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and kill some initiatives that may in fact be beneficial. We've already defunded it. Let's allow for them to prioritize what their needs are by creating the authorization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Ayala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I stand in support of this amendment, especially in view of the fact that come January, we will be having many new members of this body. We will be having a new administration coming in, and it may be important that some of these people have to make these trips for meetings to establish that initial face-to-face contact. So I think in view of that sort of an environment, I think makes it all the more important that we allow them to be able to make that travel. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Did you wish to be heard again, Senator?
Yeah, just a point of information, Mr. Chair. On page 172, section 2, we already allow for travel. It reads, government-funded travel prohibited. Funds appropriated by this act shall not be expended for off-island travel or per diem expenses by government employees and officials, excuse me, except for travel that is federally funded, travel that is specifically required to administer or secure federal grants, travel to promote tourism on Guam, provided that such travel is paid for by the Tourist Attraction Fund and is restricted to the GVB General Manager or his designee, and appropriate GVB staff and cultural performers are identified by the Board of Directors as necessary to accomplish the goal of travel. Travel by law enforcement personnel conducting an official investigation, and law enforcement personnel providing escort services for criminal suspects, detainees, convicted felons, being returned to Guam for judicial proceedings or being transferred to off-island correctional facilities. Travel by medical personnel providing escort services for patients requiring off-island medical treatment and other escorts as specifically authorized by the Department of Public Health and Social Services pursuant to Guam law. Travel necessary for the enforcement of court orders, travel under the Residential Treatment Fund, travel required for witnesses testifying on behalf of government attorneys representing the government or the people of Guam in any criminal or civil case. So it is not like it is impossible for agencies to travel. It's just that there are requirements that we set forth in this bill that I feel that are responsible requirements that are showing the people of Guam that we are taking this fiscal crisis seriously. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I understand the objection to this amendment. However, as I was going through my own memory of some travel that I've taken that was very important and necessary, that did reap some benefits. Back when the military realignment was first announced on my first term, I remember that the federal government officials were basically saying that that the money that was being looked at to be spent for this military buildup, for the most part, none of it was going to be spent outside the fence. I did travel to Washington, D.C. as the chairman of military affairs and foreign relations at that time to see if they would change that position. We met with congressmen, with senators, met with even officials within the Pentagon, and they held fast on their position that the monies for this buildup was not going to be spent outside the fence. I was very disturbed by the position because the military buildup at the time, and especially at the magnitude that it was announced it was going to be, and it was going to be done in a very short period of time, was going to create many social impacts to our island. Make a long story short, as a result, since we were getting no progress out of the federal government, I was able to set up a meeting to meet with the foreign minister of Japan to plead our case, because Japan is the partner in this whole military realignment. Japan's position at the time was that none of the Japanese contribution to this military buildup was going to be spent outside the fence either. However, because of that meeting, that face-to-face meeting that I had with the foreign minister, make a long story short, there was a commitment that was made that some money would be given to the federal government for the federal government then to be able to spend on projects outside of the fence. It was a very important meeting, but I believe it's the first time, and I know that I had no real standing to be able to speak to the foreign minister of Japan, being a senator from Guam, considering that really the negotiations on the military realignment was between the federal government and the government of Japan. However, I felt we had to at least try to get some money outside the fence. And a lot of that money that was committed by the Japanese government, as was told to me, was given to the federal government in which I believe now we are seeing some of that money, even though it may not specifically be identified as Japanese money, being sent to Guam to be able to construct some of the infrastructure that we need outside the fence. We're talking the wastewater systems, we're talking about the infrastructure issues and whatnot. Even though it does seem to come from the federal government or over the Department of Defense for this spending, I really believe that a lot of that money was the Japanese money that was pledged to be able to help us on the outside. And that was all a result of the travel that my office, I took with a senator or two to be able to meet with these officials. But there was a great benefit to that. It is important. And yes, while there is always a recognition that this travel authorization could be abused and misused, there is also the other side of that coin where this travel authorization could actually benefit our island in a very great way. The unfortunate part about being on Guam is that we are such a far distance from everybody else. There is always a comment as well, if you really want to talk to somebody overseas, just FaceTime them on the internet and you're good. That's not really how it works sometimes. To be able to reach at the highest levels, to be able to talk to the officials who actually make the decisions, I believe that interpersonal interaction is very important. To be able to have them look in your eyes, to be able to hear the tone of your voice, to understand the compassion or the passion that you have for the issues that you're talking about is important to be able to convey, and it can be conveyed most effectively on a person-to-person basis. I stand in support of this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the sentiments of the retiring speaker. And, you know, while I understand we are in a fiscal crisis, we can't forget about the duties that officials have with counterparts and other government officials abroad, regionally and nationally. And, you know, I'm very happy that that short story was shared. And I also want to relate this to official travel that was taken by members of this body. And the official travel was in part with our responsibility with the Decolonization Commission and the ability to address the United Nations, and the ability to address and talk with regional leaders and ambassadors of member states of the United Nations. And that trip was historic, as we were the largest delegation ever to approach. And we made more headway in that short trip with those face-to-face conversations than Guam had made in over a decade. And so, while I understand the fiscal realities we're in, I think if used appropriately, the benefits are vast and diverse, and I think that opportunity should remain. And so I do support this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, Senator Torres, you're welcome to close. There's been an objection. All those in favor of the Torres amendment adding a new I, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Any other senator wish to be heard on Bill 323? Any other amendments? Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we rise from the Committee of the Whole and to place Bill 323-34 COR into the third reading file, and we act on it immediately.
On that motion, is there any objection?